whole minutes.
I'm happy to, chime in with my excitement, but, I've got my trail mix and my water, so I'm looking forward to learning. But happy, if you need me, I'm here.
I think that's as good as a transition any and I'm going to make sure my email doesn't go off this whole time, but yeah, make sure, grab your snacks, grab your wine, grab seltzer, grab for those of you in cold regions, a blanket and something to get comfortable. We're, like I said, an informal bunch. So I'm going to kick things off now just because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to hear our speakers and also plenty of time to hear from you, since PAFA Pours is about conversation. So for anybody that this might be your first program with us, welcome. It's so nice to see such a nice crowd, such a good crowd tonight for PAFA Pours Making Space Queer Bodies. I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programs, and I'm going to be the facilitator for the Zoom program today. And I wanted to start off with a huge thank you to any PAFA members on the call. It's so great to see all of you, as well as just a welcome to everybody for being here. And since it's PAFA Pours, a bit of a cheers to everyone for making community tonight with us. I have my seltzer with us, but your wine, so cheers, and thank you all for being here. I wanted to mention just a few logistical things before we get started. I'm going to first start by, I think everybody is muted already. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask, just so we don't interrupt our speakers today, that you stay muted for the duration of the program, unless you're asking a question. We do want to hear from you though. So we have 3 amazing panelists that I'm going to be introducing in just a second. They're going to be sharing their screen and showing you some images and talking for the next 40 or so minutes, and then we're going to have time for conversation. So please feel free to drop things in the chat as we go. And also, if you'd like to ask a question at the end, you're welcome to use the raise hand function that I'll go over at the end of the program, or just wave us down. We're a small enough group today that I will try to find you. We'd love to hear from you. But note, those are the channels we're working with today. I did want to mention that this program is being recorded. And so if you or anyone you know wants to view this program afterwards, know it's going to be up on PAFA's YouTube channel by the end of the week. And I'll drop a link to that in the chat in just a second. I also have to mention that we have some amazing events coming up at PAFA. It's been a very busy week for events. I've really enjoyed seeing some of you at all of them, so thank you so much. But I also want to mention that starting next week, one of our panelists, Haynes, is going to be starting a 3-part class called Dangerous Bodies. It's going to be looking at the suppression of queer, trans, and feminist representation in bodies and contemporary art and art history. And so I'll drop a link to that in just a second if you're interested in hearing more. And I also, of course, have to mention that if you're in the Philadelphia region or are planning on traveling, PAFA has opened its doors once again in January. And one of the exhibitions that we're going to be highlighting today, Taking Space, Contemporary Women Artists and the Politics of Scale, is co-curated by Dr. Brittany Webb, one of our other panelists, and Jody Throckmorton on the call. It's featuring art by Haynes. So if you want to see some of this amazing work they're going to be talking about in person, I'd recommend that you reserve your ticket today, and I will also share that resource as well. I'm now so excited to hand things over to our esteemed presenters for this program. First, we have artist, writer, and PAFA alum Haynes, and then my colleagues, Dr. Brittany Webb, the Evelyn and Will Kaplan Curator of 20th Century Art and the John Roden Collection at PAFA, and the Vice President of Public Education and Engagement, Monica Zimmerman. Welcome to the 3 of you, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for being here. I'll turn it over to you all.
Thanks, Abby. Well, we are just so happy to have all of you. And I said that I would kick this off, and because any 3-person conversation needs to have like somebody that's like the fake moderator. And I was likely going to accidentally do this to my colleagues anyway. So we're just going to make it official tonight. And what I want you all to know is that we theoretically have a linear conversation. We have a series of slides. They go in an order. We thought about this. But I think also what we find is that we are also enthusiastic about this. There's so much interconnectivity between issues, questions and artworks that it's happy hour. So it's actually going to make us happier to have a non-linear conversation and see how this goes and incorporate your questions as early as we can in this program so that we can be responsive and this can be truly conversational. So one of the things that I asked my colleagues if I could ask them to start us off so that we are all starting on the same platform here, the same foundation, is to define a few terms going into this. And so my question for my two colleagues, while we're still able to see each other before we're sharing screen, is what are you talking about tonight when you are talking about the word queer? And why is this conversation interesting to you now? And why is this conversation about the body and the queer body now? How did we get to this place? What generated your interest tonight?
Are you talking, you're talking to us?
I'm talking to you.
Okay, okay, talking to me, okay. Well, just to be really simple about it, I just think LGBTQ, I think of all, sometimes I just use the word queer as an umbrella term for anybody who identifies in that spectrum. Because I think, you know, somebody might be bisexual. So like the word lesbian is a lot more specific than say queer, because you could be a bisexual woman and identify as queer. Or you could be a lesbian that identifies as queer. So that's how that works for me. And in terms of why now, I think that there's something opening up culturally. I mean, these things take time. You know, I've been doing this project that I'm going to be sharing tonight for over 20 years, and the difference between now in terms of the fact that it can actually be integrated into polite public conversation versus when I started is very, very stark. People just are a lot more comfortable with bodies, I think. But we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think that, first of all, Clarity, thank you. You've been doing such great work around this for so long, and it's such a nice moment to take stock of both makers and scholars and gatekeepers, because there are a lot of people who keep the gate in this area in our field. And then I also think that there's so much great work in the collection, in this exhibition, and work that Clarity does that pushes against heteronormativity and heterosexism. And so I would also like us to be thinking about what it is to queer gender. This is an exhibition that is contemporary women artists and the politics of scale. But we got questions about, well, what does it mean to sort of take on that category and be necessary exclusionary to folks that don't subscribe to binary gender, that binary gender can't hold who they are and the kind of work that they're making. And so this feels like a conversation where we can fold some of that in at the same time that we acknowledge, you know, there are openings and there are foreclosures.
I think that's really lovely. And I think it's probably also worth pointing out that language changes over time. And one of the things the three of us are very well aware of is that the defining what words mean, especially across a diverse group of people, is a struggle. But we love the struggle because that's where the sort of productive nuance of ideas actually lives, where you have to commit to something. And I'm very well aware that you can go back certain generations and queer means something very specific, and it is usually related to sex and gender. And I think the more we move forward, especially once queer starts to become a verb, not just a noun, to queer something, what we are starting to talk about is an entry point that just does not start with the mainstream, the normative, the previously acceptable. And there's probably also a limitation to that, because at some point everything will become queer if we do this correctly, and then nothing is queer. And what do we do with that existentially? But for now, I think all of us are talking about approaching things sometimes from a gender and sex related perspective, but ultimately also just not mainstream, not the sort of cisgendered white art world perspective that we've always brought to the way that we look at the body, and trying to queer it a little bit. So can we see some art? Dr. Webb, can you show us some art? I know that's where the control of the images lies right now.
Yes, of course. So I thought we'd start with the exhibition to give people who haven't seen it a sense of where Clarity's work falls within it. And so when you first enter the exhibition, this is the opening space. This is our opening salvo. And when I say we, I mean we PAFA, but also me and my colleague, Jody Throckmorton, who is the co-curator on this project, who is with us tonight. Hi, Jody. This is our section where we wanted to think about bodies. So if the exhibition is called Taking Space, Contemporary Women Artists and the Politics of Scale, we are thinking about scale in terms of the scale of the work, the size of the work, the scale of images within works, seriality, audacity in some cases, and materiality. They become hugely political features of a lot of the work in this exhibition. And so in this section where you're looking at scales, different scales of the body, different scales of different kinds of bodies, we have Clarity Haynes's Janie on view with Betty Saar's Shadow with Rubble Wall Laurel Canyon, and Emily Brown's At River's Edge, where the bodies take up, portions of the canvas, but also deal in negative space. And the bodies aren't necessarily portraits, they're shadows. We also have this fantastic self-portrait by Makeda Ahuja, a real allegory of her studio, which is the artist's self-portrait. She is placing her brown body into art history by placing her figure in this canvas. And there are all these sorts of references in this incredible trompe l'oeil that do that kind of work for us. But Clarity's Janie also is on view, and I'm hoping that you are taking into view that it's a nude that's not a nude. The figure is not entirely nude, right? This is a figure, she's wearing pants. You can see the size of the figure. This is an over life-size portrait. This is, there's a confrontational sort of way that nudes can sometimes seem vulnerable in art history. And what's really lovely to us is that this is a piece that doesn't have that kind of vulnerability. This is a piece that could overpower you just in terms of what Clarity has decided to do with the canvas. And I hope that you would talk to us a little bit about your process and about this piece and about Janie.
Okay, yes, absolutely. Well, in terms of the composition, I did a close crop because I really wanted to have a feeling that the figure is sort of pushing against the boundaries of the edge of the painting and almost kind of overflowing and coming out of it. And I like the idea too of creating the illusion of maybe bursting out of the picture plane as well, coming forward. Janie was a really wonderful person, and unfortunately she passed away in 2019 of ovarian cancer. But she was wonderful. Janie Martinez was an actress and activist, and she was in her 40s. She was very well loved in the New York City fat activist and performance communities. And she modeled for me over a period of about 3 years. So we became very close. And when this painting was shown at the National Portrait Gallery as part of the Outwin American Portraiture Today show, Janie came down for the opening to DC and stayed overnight in a hotel. And it was really fun and exciting. And she dressed up and, she was very proud of this painting. So I'm very happy that it is being displayed so beautiful and it's part of such a meaningful show. And I always have my models, dating back to the 90s, I've always asked them to write something after sitting. And Janie wrote, she sat for me for so long that she wrote twice, but each time it was like genius, just genius. And I love that you're sharing one of those things that she wrote. My father used to play a drawing game with us kids. He would put random dots on a page and encourage us to connect them and then maybe see what they formed. I remember finding birds, bears, and random esoteric signs in those dots. What will my scars, scratches, freckles, and stretch marks form? What art is behind the art? That's Janie Martinez on the fly, just what came to her. So she meant a lot to me, and she was incredible. And she was always like, this painting was on the cover of Sinister Wisdom, a lesbian art and writing journal. And she came to like the launch, event for that and performed. Yeah, she's sorely missed by many.
Well, what's sort of amazing is that I want to thank you for so much of this work and also for providing this kind of background to us, because having her words um, made me think about the ways that she was seeing herself through your eyes as you were depicting her. So there's the way that the body becomes a kind of landscape, the body becomes a treasure map, a road map she has in this image. And seeing you capture all of that detail, the scar, the scratch, the freckle. There's something really lovely to read her words, to sort of imagine that she's having the experience of, oh wow, you're getting all of that. There's a care to the way that you provide that level of detail in the work. And I know that this is part of a series of breast portraits that you do, but I wonder if you could talk just a bit more about that level of detail, just the ways that you're seeing the body. I mean, some of the conversation that we had in preparation for this conversation were, when we think about queer bodies, do we only mean the bodies of our sitters? Do we mean the bodies of the makers? Do we mean the bodies of knowledge that undergird the education, that artists that we're talking about, that forms their approach to art making in the world? And how important is that? And I wonder if you could just talk a bit about how you see that here and how it affects your approach in terms of technique, but also just, framing, cropping, and the fact that I feel like you have a kind of soft eye for the sitter.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really important. It's always been really important to me to try to be very clear with my work that there's a long history of the grotesque in art. And sometimes you can feel this kind of misogyny or distaste for the body in certain male artist depictions of women. And for me, it was really important that I try to communicate that that is not the direction I'm coming from. I admire the work of Ellen Altfest. I think that taking the time to go into detail is important to me. And that's why these paintings took so long to make. Because when they're larger than life, they do become like landscapes. So a mole is an event and a vein is an event. And, you just can really see them in a more abstract way, actually, than if it were smaller. And Janie was actually super straight. She loved men, and she was actually in a really happy relationship. When she died, she had finally found love, which was awesome. But I think that in the case, I always say, my sitters aren't all queer, but I am, because the way I think about the body is informed by my experience. And so, I think of someone like Joan Semmel in the 70s and how radical it was for a woman to represent herself. In my case, I might in some way be representing myself, or I might be representing someone who reminds me of a lover I've had. So there's another layer there.
That's really lovely. And just to sort of give a little bit more context, I thought we could all talk a bit about the many works from this series that we have in the collection, and the various kinds of work that they do for us. I mean, there's something, women's bodies are so political. There's something that's so political about the female nude in art history. But your experience doing breast portraits on sitters that identify as female or don't, and the ways that you've displayed this work in institutions, on social media, that's been that's been huge for you.
Yeah, and I've often encountered some resistance to the images. Yeah, they definitely seem threatening to the status quo in some way, because I've had a lot of censorship on social media, which is really odd, because there's a lot of really sexualized images of women on social media, on Instagram in particular. So it's definitely true that fat bodies, non-conforming bodies, disabled bodies, bodies of color are much more often censored than, the typical kind of aesthetically pleasing to the male gaze, sexualized images of women. So this triptych I actually did when I was a student at PAFA, and the middle image is of a model who used to model at PAFA, actually. I remember when she passed away, because there was everybody was upset about it, it was years after I graduated. But Bonnie Ann is the one on the left. She was also a model at PAFA. And then the woman on the right is the mother of someone I was in school with. And she suggested that her mother model for me because she had had breast cancer. And when she sat down and took off her shirt, I saw the other scar. And she said, oh, just ignore that. That's not why I'm here, you know. And I was like, I had like a moment of wondering, can I ignore that? Should I ignore that? So I thought about it, and I thought it would be weird to ignore that. So I said to her, do you mind if I just paint it because it's there? And she said, okay, if you want to. You know, she had gotten surgery as an infant. She had had some issue that she needed to have surgery as an infant, and that surgery saved her life. So actually, the significance of that scar was quite meaningful to her. And for me, painting that form was a really exciting experience because it was three-dimensional. It has different forms. It's unexpected. It's in that way, it's kind of abstract. It's exciting in an abstract way. And to me, there was something really beautiful about it. It kind of reminded me of like the petals of a flower or something.
Yeah. And I know we've talked a few times in our preparatory conversations also about the way some of these images operate in the world, that ways I'm sure you did not intend, specifically at PAFA, because what Clarity has given us in these pieces that have moved into our collection is this really unique moment to bring these artworks into conversations that we are having with the medical students that we work with. So we work with the healthcare community a lot, and we actually have students that are learning, they're doing part of their coursework at PAFA. And one of the goals that I'm always trying to get these students to have a positive outcome with is actually applying and practicing empathy, which is at its base activity. It's an activity of imagination, right? It's spending a little bit of your personal energy attempting to understand someone else's experience. And this is one of the best pieces I have ever seen in my life. And I do this work all week long to actually have this conversation, because for one thing, it is much harder to have empathy for strangers, I think, than it is for people you know a lot about, that you know well. So one of the things you've done here is celebrate the body, but not given us a lot of personal narrative to work through. So when I'm asking a student to actually imagine the experience of these people, they, you know what they look at when they look at your sitters here? They try to figure out why they're wearing these specific pants, because that is a choice detail that they can then hang a ton of meaning on. But the idea of doing more work, doing more imagining of what the experience of these particular sitters could be like, that's the harder version of the project, and they resist it for quite some time. And what I also find interesting is that the easiest entry points of those conversations about how could we be in community with each of these three human individuals, the easiest points of entry start on the right side. So they warm up the quickest to having a conversation about the sitter you're talking about, or the model in the middle, because they can start from a healthcare perspective. They can start by thinking about the interventions that have been performed upon the body. And they have a really hard time talking about the first image in this triptych, because what they want to say is, but that's a normal body. There's nothing to talk about there. And I find it very interesting that there is a resistance to imagining invisible traumas. There is a resistance to imagining the humanness of all three of these sitters equally. And I don't know what to do with that, but I am deeply interested in helping those healthcare students wrestle with why that is. Why is it that the imagination has such trouble doing that work on a quote unquote normal, gendered, socially acceptable body on the left? Why is that so much harder for us?
Well, and Clarity, I think there's something really poignant about you talking with the sitter and being told to ignore a scar, especially after you just said a scar is an event. I mean, there are so many ways for this image, for this person, for health science workers to understand a scar as an event. But if you are treating the body as a kind of landscape, then a scar is an event. And so what does it mean to ignore it when you are trying to render flesh on canvas? I mean, it's not I'm not entirely sure what technique they imagined you would engage in to do a portrait of a person who has a scar and have an approach to ignore the scar. I mean, should there be blank space in the canvas? I mean, what does that even look like? And I am interested in the kinds of choices you make in some of these images where we just have the torso and the, in the top of pants, which people are desperately trying to read all kinds of personality and identity work into. And a portrait where you actually do include the full top half of the figure, where we have a face, we have hair, we have jewelry. How do you make these choices?
Oh,
You're muted.
you're muted.
There we go. Okay, cool. Thank you. In this case, I just wanted to sort of, I had already started doing the breast portrait project, but I thought now I want to try to see what the head does when it's present. And Bonnie Ann had been modeling for me. Yeah, I see that Lucia just said interesting that the eyes are closed. Yeah, yeah, that kind of, the eyes are the windows to the soul. Bonnie Ann and I went through a lot. 9/11 happened while she was modeling for me for the triptych. So we kind of went through that together, like the months afterwards, all the fear, all the conversations. This is one of the reasons why I love having models. And I do love faces, but for the breast portraits, they are like, so this is not part of the breast portrait project to me, because the breast portraits are not that. And to me, not having the face, there's a lot of positive things about it. And one of them is that I think it also brings in, it accentuates the idea of the body as landscape, but it also brings in the idea of perhaps sort of a divine body. But yeah, this was pastel. I worked in pastel for a long time, and then I stopped because of the problem with dust and inhaling. I didn't want to continue that, but I loved working with pastel. And I used pastel when I did portraits. I did portraits for many years at different feminist and queer festivals and retreats outside, where I would sit outside in under a tent and just do portraits on commission, like all day long. And pastel is a very portable and quick way to work. So.
I'm gonna move us through to, there's other work in the exhibition. I thought it's really interesting to think about all of the ways that nude breasts are politicized in art and in our collection, in this exhibition. When we were thinking about works for the show, one of the things that we've been asked about this Alice Neel portrait, for folks who, I have to give the disclaimer, none of our photos of any of the works in this slideshow really do the works justice. So I really do want to encourage you all to come in and see this work in all of this incredibly rich detail, because it feels super important. And also the size of the works do a lot of work for us. So this is another piece where we have a nude that feels confrontational, and we have another, a different kind of politics in 1975 when Alice Neel is doing pregnant nudes. And there's a sort of second wave feminist impulse in art history to disrupt these kinds of narratives around virgin whore dichotomies in female nudes, to have a confrontational nude pregnant figure and throw back at you both to collapse some of the arcs of sexuality that you have in a lot of nude and a lot of female nudes in art history, in painting in particular, but also to really hold a mirror up to it and remind us that, one of the consequences of sexuality and sex is the reproduction of life. And so to have a fertile female body, to have nude breasts on a woman who might remind you, oh, right, one of the things that she might do with her nude bare breast is nourish this fetus that she's carrying. That did feel confrontational in a moment that I wonder if we could think today about whether or not that resonates with the politics of bare breasts in your practice, Clarity.
Mhm.
Sorry. Yes, I absolutely love Alice Neal. I mean, just the way she rendered that belly, like it's, you know, she takes moments and she really renders them, like that painting of Andy Warhol's, you know, nude torso is another amazing one. Like there's parts that are, you know, unfinished looking and parts that she just gets so visceral. Yeah, I think she's just, oh my God, I love her so much. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the changing politics. I mean, it's so different, you know, it's so different. The idea of a maternal nude. Diane Radke is an art historian that I have come into contact with. We were on a panel together, and she is a Paula Modersohn-Becker scholar, and she credits Paula Modersohn-Becker with being the first woman artist to paint, or actually really the first artist to paint a true like maternal nude. She talks about psychologically why that is so disturbing for the cis male psyche. And her theory, I'm going to talk about, this is one of the things I'm going to talk about in the Dangerous Bodies series of lectures and classes. But she has this whole interesting idea about how, you know, there's the idea of the female nude representing sexuality, and then there's the mother representing the mother, right? And never the two shall meet. So then when you have a nude mother, it's like mother nude, and that's like a trauma, apparently, for the sort of archetypal cisgender male psyche. So I love that. Like, I love that there's eroticism in places where you wouldn't expect it.
Well, I think Alice Neal, for me, this particular series, Claudia Bach pregnant, but the other pregnant nudes that she does of women at this time, they are a great representation for me of the wrestling with language that has to happen, that needs to keep happening, because they would never have called this a queer picture in 1975. This was like a feminist, maybe in quotations, feminist act, right? To do this radical thing about biologically female bodies. But looking backwards, what I find fascinating is that the point you made is absolutely right. This gets criticized in a lot of ways by that male dominated art world. It's problematic for them, but it also was super problematic for feminists. They had a huge problem with Neal and a huge problem with showing the biological realities of the biologically female body. They thought it was going to politically re-entrench a conversation in biology. So when I look at this, I actually think you needed the word queer then, and you didn't have it. You needed to do something that didn't work for either of the camps that were having conversations about the body that were entirely about sex and gender. Both of those binary groups rejected the project. I think that's fascinating. And it's one of the reasons
really
why
fascinating.
I love Alice Neal also. And
feminists have actually objected to my work too, because they have an idea. They tended to be from an older generation, but the idea that not to have a face is somehow dehumanizing or objectifying to a body, and that fragmenting the body is problematic. Yeah, that's amazing what you said about Alice Neal.
Yeah.
And it looks like we have a question from our colleague, Jody Throckmorton.
Well, it's not exactly a question, and this is just all I wanted to say was that, and this is anecdotally, it's not based on statistics that I have, but I heard a few years ago from a former person that used to manage our visitor services that this is one of the paintings that we actually get the most complaints about. And I don't know, Monica may have also heard this. So, you know, we have Ariadne, which is one of the first nudes ever shown in the United States, and we're known for showing nude paintings, but this, it's interesting, is one that we hear a lot of comments from the public about.
It's true. And I will tell you the hardest group to sell with this painting are actually school teachers, because it opens up a conversation they don't want to have about all the things the bodies do with with their students. But yeah, no, that still happens for sure.
And Monica, what you said about language is interesting to me, because we also didn't have language to talk about gender not matching up with what we see. Like, so now we have the language of not assuming that a body that looks like this or a body that is pregnant necessarily is a female body. So people more and more say pregnant people rather than pregnant women. And I have really enjoyed, it has helped me to talk about my work over the past 20 years as that language has evolved, because it was harder to articulate 20 years ago, but it's never just been about women for me. It has always been about different bodies and different people identifying in different ways with a gender or not. So,
yeah.
Anyway.
And that's really nice. I think that there's something about you know, bodies, embodiment, and domesticity that feels like a through line in this exhibition that we don't get to talk about enough. And so we wanted to get into it a little bit here because we had, you know, Clarity, your great work to start us off to thinking about the politics of nude breasts and what they symbolize in different images for different people, what it means to have a head attached to the torso, what it means to have a portrait of just the breasts, how we think about the breasts on a body, whether they're whether that's a body that the health sciences read in a particular way, or whether the public is reading parenthood on a body in a particular way. And there are also, you know, we have these great Judy Gellis photos too of a triptych that we have on view that are about her as a young mother trying to make work. And I thought that, you know, one of the things that we love about this work is, you know, the humor. It's very wry. It's kind of amazing. So for folks who can't read that script, the piece called Bathroom, it's dated May 23rd, 1978, and it's a self-portrait of Judy on a toilet. And the caption reads, "I would love to be able to go to the bathroom alone." And so thinking about the politics of space, the politics of domestic space, domestic interiors in this exhibition is really fascinating. The next one that's dated March 3rd, 1979 reads, "On Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday afternoon, Jason is at nursery school and David naps, and I have 1.5 hours of free time to be creative and do important things." And I know one of the things that Jody and I loved about this series for us in this exhibition is thinking about what it is to be an artist who is also a young parent who is trying to make work in a studio space, where your studio space is wherever you can clear a spot in your house. And one of the things that you need to create is space, time. You know, that's Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. And thinking time to waste. You need downtime. You cannot always be making and have no downtime. And so there's a funny way that this sort of moment of leisure gets to show up as the work at a time where that was not necessarily read as an appropriate subject for fine art. And so I wonder if we could think about embodiment and domesticity and the politics of space with both Alice Neal's Pregnant, Claudia Bach Pregnant, Gellis's Bathroom, the politics of these spaces, and also a single image from Tammy Ray Carlin's Lesbian Bed series. This is also on view in the exhibition. This is one of 3 where you have this aerial photograph of a bed, of an interior space, of an incredibly intimate space. And when folks ask, you know, well, what makes this queer? It's very easy to say, well, the title. But there is also like a really lovely bait and switch to having a series that has the title Lesbian Beds, that you know is going to be about an intimate interior space. And what Carlin doesn't give you is the figure. And so thinking about the body and domesticity and gender and all of these works, I thought it just, can we kick this ball around a bit?
I think so. And also, will you go back to the Judy Gellis one? Because I can't, so I did not realize until we were planning this conversation and I was looking at this image in a new way. I was looking at this image as part of a conversation as a queer person about the queer body. And all of a sudden, this wasn't as lighthearted to me anymore, because it's still hilarious, and it is very much about domesticity, but it's also about a privileged, safe domesticity that's very heteronormative, where she can talk about wanting privacy in the bathroom to make work as a big problem. But if you are in the queer community and you are navigating the world as a queer person, bathrooms are actually one of the most policed spaces on the planet, right? And so sort of also how do these images flip depending on who you are looking at them, and how relatable the concern is that is being brought up by the maker. And so I sort of had a moment where I went, oh no, the privilege, oh, the privilege, to want a bathroom to yourself as the final act, instead of just wanting to have a bathroom be a space where you can be you. It's a whole different question about walking into that space for me.
And on the flip side, there's a kind of politics around, for a lot of queer folks, what it means for the bed to be an intimate space that is a private space, that for some people is the like the space that is at the forefront of certainly the state apparatus's mind. All sorts of like religious rubrics around where queerness is supposed to reside, that if anywhere, only the bedroom, that there's a way that becomes all of the politics of interior spaces play out among a whole bunch of axes of social difference. And to think about embodiment and queerness in this exhibition is really like a treat to get to do a little bit. And I know we started off talking about queer bodies, but we are talking about both the bodies of the sitters that appear in images and the makers, and why they make choices around what bodies will appear and when bodies will critically refuse to appear, because this is a portrait series in a different way. And it's similar to your portrait series, Clarity, where, an artist is working with a number of sitters over time and having relationships with them as they make this work, and making the choice to do a portrait series that's not necessarily the portrait of the figures, to not give viewers, to give viewers a little bit of voyeurism, but not all of it. That also feels like incredibly political act of queer making and theorizing in art in this moment, that feels a little bit radical and revolutionary.
Brittany, thank you. I definitely feel that act of refusal is part of why I don't put the heads in. It's like it's a right to privacy for the sitters, and it's also not letting the image be consumable and not letting everything be known to the viewer. It's a kind of form of protection of sorts, maybe. And it's interesting when you show this image and there's not a figure there, but the figure is implied. It makes me think about how things can be represented conceptually without being represented literally. And I listened to a podcast in which you and Jody Throckmorton were talking about how your ideas about space in the show weren't just literal. Sometimes you were including works because you felt like they dealt with space in a more conceptual way. Maybe they were very small works, that there's different ways of thinking about, and there's a politics to actually even the economics of being able to make a large work. So that's really interesting to me.
And I want to be mindful of time, although Monica, I have to say, when you have the moment of, oh no, that's that's nirvana for curators, because we're like, yes, we have assembled things in a way that have created new thoughts that are thorny, and people have to wrestle with them now, and now they're discomfort, and sometimes that discomfort can be productive, for those of us who are within an institution, especially those of us who teach, those of us who have to engage this work with the public, right? There's a kind of thorniness that you can start to untangle once somebody has the oh no moment. It opens up a space to talk about how the mundane is actually not that mundane, that it's very easy to just skip over the politics of something as simple as a bedroom or a bathroom, that for a lot of people are simple, and that for other people are not so simple. But I see we're at 6:15, and I want to get to the chat. So I'm gonna actually stop the share just because I'm getting, ooh, yeah, I can see in the chat that there's been a bit of activity. And so I'd love to open up the conversation if that's okay, if I can play moderator for a second.
Just a reminder too, if folks want to raise their hands, you can do that by clicking the participation button, or you can just like wave at us and we will try to find you. We only have a little bit of time, so it's great to ask our amazing panelists.
I mean, if not, I'm happy to keep going.
Could you, I would love, I want to make sure there's a really great Alison Bechdel image in your PowerPoint that
Yes.
you share. And that one might be a fun way to end it, and not to like tell the panelists how to do their presentation, but as a queer woman, I'm always excited to see.
Yeah, talk about your influences.
Okay. So, well, I included this because if you will look at the figure on the motorcycle behind the person driving, you will see that she is wearing shorts with a belt, no shirt, and kind of a necklace, dog tag kind of a thing. This was sort of a 90s uniform in a way for a lot of dykes. And basically, I feel that sometimes I've had people question, like, why do your figures have pants but no shirt and then a necklace? Beth Greenfield, total 90s uniform. Yes, yes. I had a heterosexual curator ask me, say that she was uncomfortable because she kept feeling like it was wrong that there were pants but no shirt and a necklace. And basically, we're so used to the nude being this kind of consumable, totally, available image, right? The female image for male consumption. But culturally, I came of age in the 90s, and culturally, I was always around people who were dressed just like that person on the motorcycle. If it was hot outside and you were able to, people took their shirts off simply because they wanted to be comfortable. And it was a kind of a butch look. As you can see, this person, there may be breasts, but this isn't a femme person. So that's kind of where I use this to kind of show something about lesbian culture and how my work actually comes out of community, queer community. Yeah.
Does this feel like a reference point for so much of your series? I mean, I'm thinking about not just the care that you have for your sitters, but also the intentional cropping that you could crop above the waistline, but you do give just enough of the top so that we know that a sitter is wearing pants.
Right.
Well, and I think it's so interesting that you said someone found that uncomfortable, that they had the pants still on, whereas it's funny because I look at it and I think, oh, that person was always safe. That person was never more vulnerable than they were willing to be in this situation. Care was taken, agency was afforded. And so it's fascinating to me that you could read that in another direction, which was I'd be more comfortable if they were more vulnerable. Right. I mean, that says so much.
Right. Well, it's what we're used to seeing. And I always think of that Goya painting of La Maya Desnuda, the woman, she's like, reclining and everything is sort of being offered up. And I think this particular person was saying she would almost prefer that there were clothes or there weren't, but this in-between thing. Personally, I would feel comfortable wearing pants and no shirt before I would rather take my pants off, in terms of the vulnerability issue. So
interesting.
And then could you talk a bit about this pastel, this really gorgeous, lovely pastel?
Thank you. Yeah, really briefly, just this sitter I met in a situation where she was talking about these scars she had, which came from an accident she had when she was 6 years old. There was a pot of boiling water on the stove, and her sister was supposed to be watching her older sister, and she, for a moment, wasn't watching her, and she sort of pulled the pot of boiling water down on her, and so she got these scars in the shape of her dress. And she's had multiple surgeries and stuff over time, but she sat for me as a sort of pointed healing exercise. And she told me a lot about her experience of trauma and how ashamed she had been kind of her whole life, and how she always made sure to wear shirts that covered her scars. And yet, once she met someone who had had the exact same childhood accident, and their family had treated it a little differently. She was taught, that person's mother had always said, "We show your scars, don't be ashamed, there's nothing to feel ashamed of." And whereas this person, Jessica, not only felt ashamed because her family encouraged her to kind of cover her scars up, but also because she felt guilt because her sister got into trouble and her sister was supposed to be watching her. And so there was just a lot of family dynamics. So what I learned from that, and from other people who sat for me, is that trauma itself isn't, black or white, or isn't, easily understood just from looking at someone. It's really the context and how other people that are important around that person deal with the aftermath that affects what kind of memory it will be for the person, and whether it could even be a positive one. I had a woman model for me with an open heart surgery scar, and she had been in second grade at the time when she got the surgery, and all she remembered was stuffed animals and ice cream, and it was like a very positive memory for her. So anyway, yeah.
And do you find that you often have conversations with your sitters as you're painting them, as you're drawing them, about their traumas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not always. I always try to make them feel really comfortable. And sometimes we're just like goofy and we listen to music and we tell jokes and it's very light. My grandmother was a beautician, and she also wrote, and she wrote a little sort of pamphlet about how to be a good beautician called The Power Behind the Comb. And and it was all about your relationships. You have your friendships with your customers, so they keep coming back. And it's always been really important to me to create a really safe space and a fun space. So I pick up on what people feel like doing. If they're tired and they want to close their eyes and not talk, if they feel like chatting, if we want to listen to music, or sometimes the conversations get really intense and personal, and like I learn about traumas that they've been through.
Thank you for that. There's a real care to that. And then we sort of wanted to end with the classic image that people know PAFA for, which is the cast hall, just to bring our conversation back around to the kinds of bodies that get centered in art, historical, and museological practice.
And this feels particularly important to me for PAFA to wrestle with, right? Because as a sort of bastion of classical figurative arts education, while attempting to evolve a pedagogy around collecting and exhibiting and programming that is not centered in this place, like what do we do with the fact that this is how you learn to draw the human body in your freshman year of college? Like what are we doing, and how do we unpack that? What are the corrections to that, and what are the implications? And it's something I think about almost every day in the before times, because this is right outside of my office. So I walk out and I see an incredibly gendered and incredibly idealized, actually so idealized that some of these they're beyond anatomically correct. They're anatomically unachievable, like the discus thrower. They've done the research. The human body doesn't do this. So what do we do that this is what we have venerated and sort of built at least the Western canon of art history around? And I know, Clarity, you said some incredible things about sort of encountering also the masculinity of the body images that we use to form the basis of arts education.
Yeah, the Vitruvian man.
Absolutely.
And in ways that are narrowing, because you think really expansively about masculinity on all kinds of figures. I mean, we have talked about masculinity on a woman's body, or on a non-binary body, on a body with breasts. And that is not the kind of embodied masculinity that gets taught in your sort of first year art historical courses. And so what is that doing for how young artists are taught to render flesh and to sort of capture the full expanse of the human figure?
And what do we do with the fact that of the biologically female bodies that are in this space, the female ones still have fig leaves on them in their middle areas. That drives me absolutely nuts.
And I also often experience this weird thing of being torn between the feminist art world and the queer art world, in that the queer art world is very masculine. And often an image like this of a body that looks like that is taken as the de facto queer body. And rather than, say, a Laura Aguilar photograph. So I do feel like I'm a bit of an activist in the queer community. I did an Instagram project where I posted like women and non-binary artists that are queer for like a year. And I just every day posted a different one. And I posted Queer Art Now as if that was the front of Art News, because Art News had done a Queer Art Now issue that just totally kind of excluded like lesbians completely. So yeah, there's definitely that patriarchal feeling sometimes also in the queer art world and queer art history.
Yeah.
I wanted to jump in too, and I think we might go a minute or two over to make sure we get to some of these great questions, but kind of on the subject of looking at that last image too, I wanted to ask, one of the things about your work that I think is also inclusive is that you're not drawing, sometimes you're depicting the fat body, and that's another group of people that is often excluded in different communities. I was even a little horrified when we advertised this program. There were some fat phobic comments on the image of Janie, and I know I had met with you and I knew the story of her. So I was wondering how you deal with that on top of being a queer woman and a queer woman and looking at that representation, but also these kind of body ableist things that I think could be launched at your work.
That happens sometimes. If you look at the comments when people post my work, you'll sometimes see like those kinds of jokes, you know, people are obviously uncomfortable. So I just don't respond. And I also don't read comments. Like when I write something, I've never read the comments after, because I know that it can be controversial and I don't want to upset myself. Like, I feel like I just do a lot of self-protection actually, to be able to exist in the world and put stuff out there and let those that will connect with it. Because originally the project started in very safe spaces, like either in my studio or in a specifically queer or feminist space. So it's very different to just be out in the world, and there's like a random quality to the internet, you know? So yeah.
It also, to me, makes it even more important, the work that you are doing and the work that Brittany and Jody are doing, and the work that sort of other pioneers in the art world are doing to make these spaces, because it's one thing to feel uncomfortable with something in the world. It is another thing to feel uncomfortable and feel that things that make you uncomfortable should be attacked. And I think as a community, as people with the power that comes with being affiliated with cultural institutions, there is a responsibility there to step into that space and hold these conversations and normalize not the bodies of the cast hall, but to normalize the bodies we actually own and live inside of and love inside of. So it just, I think that particular response also just made me want you to paint again, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I just want to just say that I am so grateful to all of you for the work you're doing at PAFA. You, Monica, Dr. Brittany Webb, Jody Throckmorton, Brooke Anderson. This is nothing short of a revolution within PAFA, which I've been sort of, you know, part of for long before. And also within the larger art world, when it comes to ideas of collecting and feminist curating, you guys are on the cutting edge big time. And I think other institutions can learn from what you're doing. Like, you are not doing this in any kind of half-assed way. I mean, there's passion behind it. And I haven't seen the show taking space yet, but I can't wait to. And I feel goosebumps just thinking about it, because it's literally taking over the museum, literally the whole thing, which is outrageous. And so much of the work looks really it's sort of exuberant, and it just makes me really happy.
Oh. Thank you. That's for those kind words and for being a part of our programming. I did want to make sure we asked just a question or two, if that's all right, even though that's like the perfect way to be like, goodbye, everybody. Like, I do want to make sure our audience, we invited you for this community to hear you. And we have two great questions. I think one asking what's next, and maybe we can save that for the end for you, Clarity, and tie it back into your class. But also one for Maureen asking if you've ever had the experience of sitting for another artist, which selfishly, I'm just really intrigued with that. If you have done that, what that felt like.
I have. I find it really relaxing because you don't have to do anything. They're the ones doing the work. I have done it a couple of times. I did it with some fellow students when I was at PAFA. We did exchange with each other. And my mentor, my first mentor, starting from when I was rather young, Carlo Pittore, I modeled for him a few times. And I learned from him how to kind of engage and how to have a conversation and how to have fun. Yeah. And I try to think about how for my models, it can be relaxing to, you know, like it is nice to not have to do anything.
That's I think a very healthy way of approaching that too. And so I guess as the last question of Clarity, what's next for you?
Well, I feel emotional about the breast portrait project because I have not been able to work with a model throughout this whole COVID experience, which makes me really sad. Once I'm able to do that again, I very much probably will. But during this time, I've been working on these still life altar paintings that kind of came out of the breast portraits. They came out of the jewelry and the cultural sort of expression of my models. And they're also representing a kind of sacred, safe space of like the divine feminine and queerness and joy outside of patriarchal religion and culture. But then something happened too, where the figure came back into my work recently, and I haven't shown this at all publicly yet, but I've been obsessed and interested with images on Instagram of birth, because I've always been fascinated with what birth looks like. And so I was reading The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, and it says something in there about how birth crowning images should be on mugs. And I just thought that was hilarious. So I started doing images of crowning using photographs I found on Instagram or sometimes video stills. And then I also asked my community if anybody has their own birth photos they'd like to share with me. And a few people did. So I'm working on the figure again from this new point of view, which is again cropping the figure, and again something that might be censored, something that's unexpected, something that could be construed as very heterosexual, but I'm not approaching it that way. And there's a bit of an eroticism to it. Like I think about Betty Tompkins, you know, and her very, very challenging, wonderful, you know, I guess you could call them vulva images that are drawn from pornography. So I like the idea of the crowning image because it sort of relates to pornography, but it completely also kind of debunks it in a way because it's like something's coming out. So anyway, it's really fun, but I haven't really gotten a lot of feedback on it yet. So more will be revealed on that.
And wait, we have to do one last question though, Abby, which is what about your class? If we take your class,
oh my God,
what are we going to talk about?
You're going to see years and years of my research and thinking, because this is, of course, like the things I care most about. So artists that I've, you know, been inspired by, that I've found in my research, artists that are working now, historical artists I might have just found out about this year, as well as some ideas from different thinkers like Diane Radke's idea about the maternal nude, or Alison Gingerus is a curator, Alison Gingerus, who's really cutting edge feminist curator, who has done, she was part of a censorship panel I did at CAA, and she has put an image of a Joan Semmel painting next to a Betty Tompkins painting and shown how the culture of sex positive versus anti-porn would separate these two images. Normally, she showed how similar they were in coming together and putting them right next to each other. So those are just a few of the people I'll be talking about, and also images of non-conforming bodies in art history that have been how they have been depicted, like how have old women been depicted in the history of painting? you know? How have some of these non-conforming images become part of what maybe misogyny in the world has construed as like a demonic feminine? So yeah, but there's three, and the first one is the use of the body, the second one is orientation, and the third is resistance. So probably more about social media censorship and stuff will be in the third class, and more art historical stuff will be in the first class.
Cool. Thank you. I'm excited. I'll be there.
Yay.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you our three amazing panelists for sharing work about the exhibition and your expertise and your artwork. It's been a pleasure, and I'm so glad that we can say that this will be continued in Clarity's class next week. So we hope to see you all there, and feel free to unmute yourself. I'm going to make that possible real quick on the way back out and say goodbye. It's always nice to hear from you. So take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Loved it.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Abby.
Lovely
Bye.
evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.